what if the man who tipped you $100 every night, the one with the fedora and the faded rose tattoo, wasn't just another lonely soul, but the architect of an empire built on blood? And what if, in his final days, he decided you were the one who deserved to inherit it all? Pamela Richard had nothing but kindness to offer. At 29, drowning in debt and dead-end shifts, a warm smile and a cut piece of toast were all she could give to Herbert Franklin, the silent old man who haunted Booth 7 every evening. She thought he was just another ghost from a forgotten era. She had no idea his name once made mayors sweat and rivals disappear. Because one rainy Tuesday, the bell above the diner door didn't ring for Herbert. It rang for his lawyers, flanked by 10 bodyguards in black suits, and they were there for her. If you're excited to dive into this story, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us share more amazing stories. And believe me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's jump into the story. The bell above the door of the Rusty Spoon Diner wasn't a cheerful sound. It was a dull, metallic clang, worn thin by years of announcing the arrival of truckers, insomniacs, and people with nowhere else to go. The diner itself was a relic trapped in amber, cracked vinyl booths the color of dried blood, a linoleum floor that stuck to your shoes, and the permanent stench of burnt coffee mingling with cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls decades ago. For Pamela Richard, Pam to the cook, Miss Richard to the few polite customers, it was both a cage and a lifeline. For the past 4 years, 6 nights a week, from 6 o'clock p.m. to 2 a.m., Pamela had performed the tired choreography of survival. She moved through the narrow aisles with practiced efficiency, balancing plates without thought, refilling coffee before it was asked for, and wearing a smile that felt more like armor than warmth. Her hands were calloused, her feet ached, and her apron was stained with grease that never fully washed out. Her real life? That was locked away in a cramped studio apartment 3 blocks over. Buried under unpaid medical bills from her father's funeral and credit card statements she couldn't bear to open. She'd once dreamed of nursing school, of saving lives instead of serving pancakes. But dreams cost money, and money was something Pamela Richard hadn't seen in years. Not the kind that mattered, anyway. The late shift regulars were a predictable parade. There was Eddie, the long-haul trucker who always ordered the meatloaf and complained it was dry. There were the 2 nurses from the hospital down the street who whispered about their shift drama over wilted Caesar salads. And there was Lonnie, the cook, who chain-smoked in the alley and never spoke unless you asked him a direct question. And then there was Herbert Franklin. Herbert wasn't a regular in the usual sense. He was a presence, as permanent and unsettling as the flickering neon sign outside that read, "Open 24 hours," in faded red letters. Every single evening at exactly 8 o'clock p.m., the bell would clang, and in he'd walk. Same dark wool coat, even in summer. Same black fedora pulled low over pale, unreadable eyes. Same black leather gloves. And always, always, Booth 7, the one in the back corner by the emergency exit. He never looked at anyone, never greeted anyone. He moved like a man who'd learned long ago how to occupy space without disturbing it. His face was a battlefield of deep lines, his expression carved from stone. But it was the rose tattoo on his neck, faded to a dull green, its petals blurred by time, that made people nervous. Even Lonnie, who feared nothing, would glance up from the grill when Herbert walked in, and then look away fast. The first time Herbert came in, Pamela's boss, a wiry man named Ray, who reeked of cheap cologne and desperation, had pulled her aside. "Don't waste time on the guy in 7. He don't talk, he don't smile, he don't want conversation. Black coffee, rye toast, apple pie. That's it. He pays exact, tips heavy, and leaves. Just let him be." Denise, The day shift veteran, with a voice like gravel and a heart to match, had sneered, "Creepy old bastard gives me the willies. Probably did time. You see those tats? That ain't no Sunday school ink." But Pamela saw something else. She saw the way Herbert's left hand trembled when he lifted his coffee cup. She saw the way his jaw tightened when the door opened unexpectedly. She saw a man who'd built walls so high, no one bothered trying to climb them anymore. And maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was just the part of her that still believed people were worth the effort, but she ignored Ray's advice. The first night, she set the menu down in front of him. "Good evening, sir. I'm Pamela. Can I start you with some coffee?" He grunted. Didn't look up. She poured the coffee anyway. When she brought his order, black coffee, rye toast, a slice of apple pie, she noticed the way his knuckles were swollen, the way his fingers struggled to grip the knife. The next night, she did the same. "Evening, Mr. Franklin," she said, though he'd never told her his name. She'd seen it on the credit card receipt. For 2 weeks, he said nothing, just ate in silence, left a crisp $100 bill folded under his saucer, and disappeared into the night like smoke. Then, one evening, in the 3rd week, Pamela watched him struggle with the toast. His hand shook so badly the knife clattered against the plate. Without asking, without making a show of it, she reached over and cut the toast into neat triangles. Herbert Franklin's pale eyes snapped up to meet hers. For the first time, he looked at her, really looked. "People don't do things they don't have to," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel scraped across tin. Pamela smiled, small, genuine. Maybe they should. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition, like she'd answered a question he'd been asking for a very long time. From that night on, Herbert Franklin started talking, just a little, about loyalty, about men who didn't keep their word, about choices you can't undo, and friends who don't call anymore because they're 6 feet under. Pamela didn't pry. She didn't need to know why his eyes flickered toward the door every time it opened, or why he always sat facing the exit. She just listened. And in the fluorescent glow of the Rusty Spoon diner, between the clatter of dishes and the hum of the old jukebox, Pamela Richard had no idea she was talking to a legend, a man whose name had once been whispered in back rooms and courtrooms across New Jersey. To her, he was just Mr. Franklin, the quiet man with kind eyes and a past too heavy to carry alone. Over the following weeks, Pamela learned to read Herbert Franklin the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm, through small, barely perceptible shifts that most people would miss entirely. She noticed the way he folded his money. Not carelessly stuffed into a wallet like most customers, but precise, deliberate. Each bill aligned perfectly, creased once vertically, then slipped beneath the coffee saucer with surgical precision. Always a $100 bill. Never less. Never more. As if the amount itself was a ritual he couldn't break. She noticed the way he positioned himself in booth 7. Never with his back to the room, always facing the door, his body angled slightly toward the emergency exit, as if he were constantly calculating distances, measuring escape routes. His coat stayed on, even on sweltering August nights when the diner's ancient air conditioner wheezed uselessly. The fedora never left his head. She noticed the way he reacted to touch. The first time she'd cut his toast, her hand had accidentally brushed his wrist. He'd flinched, not dramatically, but enough. A tightening of his jaw, a barely perceptible recoil, like a man who'd learned that human contact usually preceded violence. After that, Pamela made sure to keep her distance, to hover her hands just above the table when she served him, giving him space that felt like respect. And she noticed the tremor, not just in his hands, but in the way his whole body would go rigid when the bell above the door rang unexpectedly. His eyes would flick toward the entrance, sharp and assessing, before his expression smoothed back into that impenetrable mask. It was the look of a man who'd spent a lifetime watching his back and couldn't stop, even now. The other regulars noticed too, but where Pamela saw vulnerability, they saw threat. "That old guy gives me the creeps," Denise muttered one night during shift change, lighting a cigarette by the kitchen door. "You seen those tattoos? My ex-husband had ink like that. Did 8 years in Rahway for aggravated assault." She exhaled smoke through her nostrils. "You ask me, Franklin's got the same look. Like he's killed somebody and got away with it." Eddie, the trucker, was less subtle. One evening, as Pamela refilled his coffee, he nodded toward booth 7. "That the guy who tips you all that cash?" "Mr. Franklin?" "Yes." Eddie's eyes narrowed. "Franklin. Herbert Franklin." He said the name slowly, like he was testing it against something in his memory. "You know, I swear I seen his face before, in one of them documentaries, about the mob families up in Newark. Back in the 70s, 80s. Pamela laughed, a sound she hoped came across as dismissive. "Eddie, you think everyone's in the mob. Last month you said the mailman looked like a hitman." "Yeah, well, the mailman don't have a prison tat on his neck." Eddie leaned in, lowering his voice. "I'm telling you, Pam, that rose, that's old school organized crime Inc. Means something specific. Blood in, blood out, that kind of thing." She waved him off, but the comment lodged itself somewhere in her mind. A splinter she couldn't quite remove. 2 nights later, she caught Herbert staring out the window. Nothing unusual in that. He often watched the street, tracked the headlights drifting past like slow-moving constellations. But this time was different. A police cruiser had pulled up across the street, its engine idling, the silhouette of 2 officers visible in the front seat. They were probably just on break, grabbing coffee from the 7-Eleven next door. But Herbert had gone completely still. Not tense, that would have been too obvious. Instead, he'd adopted the absolute motionlessness of a predator trying not to be seen. His coffee cup hovered halfway to his lips, forgotten. His eyes tracked the cruiser with an intensity that made Pamela's skin prickle. The police car sat there for maybe 3 minutes. Then the driver's door opened, and one of the officers stepped out, stretched, and walked toward the convenience store. Herbert exhaled, set down his cup. His hand, Pamela noticed, wasn't shaking anymore. She approached his table with the coffee pot, her voice carefully casual. "Refill, Mr. Franklin?" "Please?" His voice was steady, but she could see the faint sheen of sweat on his temple. She poured. "You okay? You look a little pale." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "Old habits. Some things you never stop watching for." "The police?" His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement. "Among other things." She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to ask why a man his age was still looking over his shoulder, still flinching at sirens, still calculating exits. But she'd learned by now that Herbert Franklin spoke when he was ready, and not a moment before. So she just nodded. "Well, if you need anything, I'm right here." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "I know you are, Miss Richard. That's why I keep coming back." Their quiet companionship deepened in the way that only happens between 2 people who understand loneliness, not as something to be cured, but as something to be witnessed. Herbert began arriving earlier, staying later. Some nights, he'd sit in booth 7 until nearly midnight, long after he'd finished his pie, nursing cold coffee and staring at nothing in particular. And he started talking, not in confessions or grand revelations, but in fragments. pieces of a story too jagged and dangerous to tell all at once. One night, as Pamela wiped down the counter, Herbert said suddenly, "You ever been betrayed, Miss Richard? Really betrayed?" She paused, thinking of her ex-boyfriend who'd emptied her checking account and disappeared. Once. It hurt. Hurt. He turned the word over like a foreign object. That's one way to put it. When I was younger, I had a partner. We built something together. Something big. He was like a brother to me. Closer than a brother. His fingers drummed against the table. Tap, tap, tap. Then one day, he decided what we built was worth more without me in it. Went to the people we worked for. Made a deal. Gave them my name. Pamela set down her rag. What happened? I survived. He didn't. Herbert's voice was flat, factual. That's what loyalty costs sometimes. Blood. She should have been disturbed. Should have made an excuse and walked away. Instead, she found herself asking, "Do you regret it?" Regret what? Surviving? He finally looked at her. I regret trusting him in the first place. I regret thinking loyalty meant something to a man who'd sell his own mother if the price was right. He picked up his coffee, stared into it like it held answers. Most of the people I knew back then are dead now. The ones who aren't wish they were. Friends? Pamela asked quietly. We called each other that. But friends don't end up buried in pine boxes before they're 40. Friends don't disappear in the middle of the night because they talk to the wrong people. He set the cup down with deliberate care. I stopped counting the graves a long time ago, Miss Richard. After a while, they all blur together. It was the most he'd ever said at once. Pamela felt the weight of it, not just the words, but the lifetime of violence and loss beneath them. I'm sorry, she said, because what else could she say? Don't be. I made my choices. Every one of them. His eyes, usually so guarded, held something that might have been honesty. But I'll tell you this. When you build your life on fear, you end up alone. And when you're alone long enough, you forget what it feels like when someone's kind for no goddamn reason at all. He stood then, slower than usual, and laid the folded $100 bill beneath his saucer. Good night, Miss Richard. Good night, Mr. Franklin. She watched him walk out into the October darkness, his coat collar turned up against the wind, and wondered, not for the first time, who Herbert Franklin really was. The gifts started the following week. The first was an old locket, tarnished silver with delicate filigree etched into its surface. Herbert placed it on the table one evening beside his empty pie plate. My wife's, he said simply. She died 20 years ago. No children. No one to leave it to. He slid it across the table. Thought you might like it. Pamela picked it up carefully. Inside was a photograph, faded, black and white, of a woman with dark eyes and a gentle smile. Mr. Franklin, I can't. You can. She would have liked you. She had a soft heart, too. Got her killed, in the end. He said it without self-pity, just stating a fact. Wear it, don't wear it, doesn't matter. Just don't let it sit in a drawer somewhere. Forgotten. The next gift came 3 days later. A pack of vintage cigarettes in a red and gold box, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in decades. The cellophane was still intact. I don't smoke, Pamela said, confused. I know, but you're an artist, aren't you? I seen the sketch you left in your apron pocket last week. Fell out when you were reaching for your notepad. Herbert tapped the cigarette pack. Artists used to smoke these. Painters, writers. Back when things meant something. Thought you'd appreciate the history." She stared at him. "How did you—" "I notice things, Miss Richard. Same as you." The final gift arrived on a Thursday night in late October. A photograph, crisp despite its age, of a rose garden in full bloom. The roses were white, their petals luminous even in black and white. In the background, barely visible, was a large house, stately, elegant, with columns and ivy crawling up the walls. "Where is this?" Pamela asked, turning the photo over. There was an address written on the back in faded ink, 49 Harbor Street. "Somewhere I used to live, long time ago." Herbert's expression was unreadable. "Before everything went to hell. Those roses, my mother planted them. Said white roses meant new beginnings, redemption." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "I never believed her." "Do you still own it?" "In a manner of speaking." He drained the last of his coffee. "Everything I own for a reason, Miss Richard. And everything I give away for a reason too." She wanted to ask what he meant. Wanted to ask why he was giving her these things. Fragments of a life she didn't understand. Pieces of a puzzle she couldn't see. But Herbert was already standing, already reaching for his coat. "I'll see you tomorrow night," he said. But something in his voice, a finality she couldn't quite name, made her chest tighten. "Mr. Franklin?" He paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "Thank you for the gifts, for trusting me with them." He didn't turn around, just nodded once and stepped out into the night, the bell clanging behind him like a funeral toll. Pamela stood there for a long moment, the photograph of the rose garden still in her hands. She traced the address with her thumb, 49 Harbor Street, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind seeping through the diner's cracked door. She didn't realize she was holding a map. She didn't realize every gift had been a breadcrumb, and she didn't realize that Herbert Franklin had been saying goodbye. The rain started at 7:30, exactly 30 minutes before Herbert Franklin was supposed to walk through the door. It wasn't the gentle kind of rain that misted windows and made the world soft. This was the violent, angry kind, the kind that hammered against the diner's glass like it was trying to break through, that turned the parking lot into a black mirror reflecting the sickly glow of the neon sign. Thunder rolled in from somewhere over the river, low and ominous, rattling the silverware in their plastic bins. Pamela watched the rain streak down the windows as she refilled the napkin dispensers, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. Tuesday nights were always slow, just a handful of regulars nursing coffee until the storm passed, the occasional trucker stopping for directions. The diner felt hollow, cavernous, filled with the sound of rain and the low murmur of the television mounted in the corner, its volume barely audible over the weather. At 7:55, she glanced at booth 7. Empty, waiting. She'd already wiped it down twice, set out the silverware wrapped in its paper napkin, filled the sugar dispenser even though it was already full. Habits, rituals, the small acts of preparation that made her feel less like she was waiting and more like she was simply doing her job. 8 o'clock came. The bell above the door didn't ring. Pamela looked up from the coffee station, her hands stilling on the pot she'd just brewed, fresh, the way Herbert liked it. Through the rain-blurred glass, she could see the empty sidewalk, the parking lot, the street beyond where headlights cut through the downpour in irregular intervals. No dark coat, no fedora. No slow, deliberate shuffle of an old man who moved like every step cost him something. She told herself he was just late. The weather was bad. Maybe he'd decided to stay home tonight, wait out the storm. He was 80 years old, after all. It made sense. It was reasonable. But Herbert Franklin had never been late. Not once in the 4 months she'd known him. 8:15. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like 1,000 fingernails. One of the regulars, a middle-aged woman who worked nights at the hospital, asked for her check. Pamela processed it mechanically, smiled when she received a tip, and watched the woman dash to her car through the deluge. 8:30. The diner had emptied except for Eddie, who sat at the counter working on a crossword puzzle, and a young couple in booth 3 who were too absorbed in each other to notice anything else. Lonnie appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his grease-stained apron. "Franklin not coming tonight?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I don't know." Pamela looked toward the door again, as if the act of looking could summon him. "He's never missed a night," Lonnie grunted. "Weather's shit. Probably smart enough to stay home." But he didn't sound convinced, and neither was Pamela. She poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't want and took up a position by the register where she had a clear view of both the door and booth 7. The empty booth seemed to mock her. The clean table, the waiting silverware, the space where Herbert should have been but wasn't. At 8:45, she started wiping down tables that didn't need wiping. The couple in booth 3 left, giggling and holding hands, oblivious to the knot of anxiety tightening in Pamela's chest. Eddie finished his crossword, paid, and trudged out into the rain with a mumbled goodbye. The diner was empty now, except for her and Lonnie. The silence between the thunderclaps was oppressive, heavy with absence. 9 o'clock. Pamela stood at booth 7, her cleaning rag in one hand, staring at the empty vinyl seat. The overhead light hummed softly, casting harsh shadows across the table. She could picture him so clearly. The way he'd sit with his back straight despite his age. The way his pale eyes would track her movements. The way his mouth would twitch into that almost smile when she said something that amused him. "Miss Richard, you okay?" Lonnie's voice came from behind her. She turned. "He's never late, Lonnie. Not once." "Maybe he's sick. Maybe he finally decided an 80-year-old man don't need to be out in weather like this." Maybe. But the word tasted like a lie. She thought about the gifts, the locket, the cigarettes, the photograph of the rose garden with the address written on the back. "Everything I own for a reason. And everything I give away for a reason too." The finality in his voice when he'd said goodbye last Thursday. "I'll see you tomorrow night." But there had been something else beneath those words. Something that sounded uncomfortably like maybe, or if I can, or one last time. She'd dismissed it then. Now, standing in front of his empty booth, with rain hammering against the windows and thunder shaking the walls, she felt that dismissal curdle into dread. "I'm going to clean up early tonight," she said quietly. "I don't think anyone else is coming in." Lonnie nodded. "Yeah, I'll start closing down the kitchen." For the next hour, Pamela moved through the diner like a ghost, her actions mechanical, her mind spinning. She wiped down every surface twice. She restocked everything that didn't need restocking. She counted the register 3 times and got 3 different numbers because she couldn't focus, couldn't stop glancing at the door, couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. At 10:30, she locked the door behind her and stood under the diner's awning, staring out at the rain-soaked street. Her car was parked 20 feet away, but she couldn't make herself move toward it. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened the browser, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. Herbert Franklin, New Jersey. The search results loaded slowly, the screen blurring in the rain. News articles, old photographs. A Wikipedia entry for a Herbert Franklin who died in 1987. Wrong person. Another for a Herbert Franklin who'd been a union organizer in the 1960s. Also wrong. Then, near the bottom of the first page, a headline from a true crime blog. The Franklin crime family. Where are they now? Her breath caught. She clicked the link, but her phone's connection was spotty, the page loading in fragments. She saw a black and white photograph. A young man, maybe 30, with dark hair and cold eyes and a rose tattoo visible on his neck. The caption read, Herbert the Rose Franklin, alleged enforcer for the Newark. The page timed out. Pamela stood there in the rain, her phone clutched in her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to reload the page, but the connection was gone. She'd have to wait until she got home, until she had Wi-Fi, until she could confirm what Eddie had said, what Denise had hinted at, what she'd been too afraid or too naive to consider. Herbert Franklin wasn't just an old man. He was someone people remembered, someone people wrote articles about, someone people probably wanted dead. Wednesday came gray and cold, the storm having passed but leaving the city wrapped in low clouds and lingering dampness. Pamela called in sick to her morning shift, something she never did, and spent 2 hours online, falling down a rabbit hole of articles, forum posts, and archived news clippings. Herbert the Rose Franklin, alleged enforcer, suspected in multiple homicides, ties to organized crime families. Last known activity in the late 1980s, after which he'd seemingly vanished. Some sources claimed he'd been killed. Others said he'd made a deal and disappeared into witness protection. A few suggested he'd simply retired, too dangerous to pursue, too careful to catch. There were photographs, grainy, decades old, but unmistakably him. The same sharp features, the same cold eyes, the same rose tattoo. In one picture, he stood beside a man identified as Vincent Moretti, a known crime boss. In another, he was being led away in handcuffs, his face emotionless, his hands cuffed behind his back. Pamela stared at the screen until her eyes burned. This was the man she'd served pie to, the man she'd cut toast for. The man who'd called her Miss Richard and tipped her $100 and talked about loyalty and betrayal and friends who'd ended up buried. He hadn't been speaking in metaphors. At noon, she got in her car and drove. She didn't consciously decide to do it. One moment, she was sitting in her apartment, her laptop open to a photograph of Herbert Franklin from 1982, and the next, she was behind the wheel, pulling out onto the street, navigating by memory toward the neighborhood where she'd occasionally seen him walking in the early evenings. She found the brownstone on Maple Street, a narrow 3-story building squeezed between identical structures, its brick facade dark with age and moisture. The address matched the one she'd seen on an old police report listed in one of the articles. Pamela parked across the street and stared. The house looked abandoned, not in the obvious way. There were no broken windows, no overgrown lawn, no notices taped to the door. But the curtains were drawn tight across every window, the kind of drawn that suggested no one had opened them in days. The small concrete stoop was empty except for leaves blown against the base of the door. And there, placed carefully on the top step, was a single white rose. Fresh. Its petals still perfect despite the rain. Its stem trimmed clean. Pamela's hands tightened on the steering wheel. White roses meant new beginnings, redemption. That's what Herbert had said his mother believed. They also, she knew from a lifetime of attending funerals, meant remembrance. Goodbye. She sat there for 20 minutes, watching the house, waiting for movement, for a light to flick on, for Herbert to appear and prove her spiraling anxiety wrong. But the house remained still, silent, guarded by that single white rose like a tombstone flower. Finally, she pulled out her phone and dialed information. "Yes, I'm looking for a number for Herbert Franklin on Maple Street." A pause. "No, I don't have the exact address. Maple Street in Newark." Another pause. "Nothing listed? Are you sure?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Okay, thank you." She tried the hospital next, then another hospital, then a third. "I'm looking for a patient, Herbert Franklin. He's 80 years old. He may have been admitted in the last 24 hours. Each time, the same answer. No one by that name. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. That night, Pamela returned to work even though her shift didn't start until 6. She arrived at 5 to unlock the door with her key and walked straight to booth 7. She stood there in the empty diner, in the gray afternoon light filtering through unwashed windows, and stared at the space where Herbert Franklin had sat every night for 4 months. The vinyl was cracked. The table was scratched. There was a coffee ring near the edge that wouldn't come out no matter how hard she scrubbed. It was just a booth. Nothing special. Nothing remarkable. But it felt like a grave. Pamela pulled out her phone and looked at the photograph she'd found online. Herbert Franklin, circa 1983, being led away by federal agents. His expression in the photo was blank, unreadable. The face of a man who'd learned to reveal nothing. But she'd seen beneath that face. She'd seen the man who'd struggled with his toast. The man who'd talked about friends who were gone. The man who'd looked at her with something that might have been hope and said, "When you build your life on fear, you end up alone." "Where are you?" she whispered to the empty booth. The diner didn't answer. Only the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the settling of old wood and older memories. At 8 o'clock, the bell rang. Pamela's head snapped up, her heart leaping. But it was just Eddie, shaking rain from his jacket, oblivious to the way her hope had flared and died in the space of a heartbeat. "Hey, Pam, coffee?" "Yeah," she said, her voice hollow. "Sure." She poured him coffee. She took orders. She moved through her shift like a sleepwalker. And every time the bell rang, she looked up, expecting a dark coat and a fedora and pale eyes that had seen too much. But Herbert Franklin didn't come. And deep in her bones, in the place where instinct lives, Pamela knew he never would again. Thursday night. The rain had returned, lighter than Tuesday's deluge but persistent, the kind of cold drizzle that seeped into your bones and wouldn't let go. The diner was half full, a better crowd than usual for a Thursday. A group of college kids occupied booth 2, sharing a plate of fries and pretending to study. An elderly couple sat at booth 5, eating in comfortable silence. Eddie was at the counter, as always, working through his chili and cornbread. Pamela moved through her shift on autopilot, her body going through the motions while her mind remained elsewhere. She'd barely slept in 2 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that white rose on Herbert's doorstep, saw the drawn curtains, saw the empty booth 7 that now felt less like a seat and more like an open wound. She'd tried to convince herself there were innocent explanations. He'd gone to visit family. He'd taken a trip. He'd finally decided that an 80-year-old man with arthritis had no business eating diner food every night. But she didn't believe any of it. At 9 o'clock, she was refilling coffee for the elderly couple when the bell above the door rang. The sound cut through the diner's ambient noise like a knife. Pamela looked up, coffee pot still in hand, and froze. 10 men had entered the diner. Not customers, not truckers stopping for a meal. Not lost travelers looking for directions. 10 men in black suits, their presence so absolute, so consuming, that the diner seemed to shrink around them. They didn't walk in so much as materialize, filling the doorway like a wall of dark fabric and hard faces. Rain dripped from their shoulders, pooling on the linoleum, but none of them moved to shake it off or remove their coats. The diner went silent. Even the jukebox seemed to quiet, though Pamela knew that was impossible. The men formed a loose semicircle just inside the entrance, blocking the door completely. They weren't explicitly threatening. Their hands were visible, their expressions professionally blank. But there was something in their stillness, their uniformity, that screamed danger. These were men trained to be intimidating without saying a word, to command a room simply by occupying it. Behind them, partially obscured, were 4 more figures. Bigger, broader. They didn't wear suits. They wore tactical clothing, dark and practical, with the unmistakable bulk of concealed weapons beneath their jackets. Bodyguards, security, whatever you wanted to call them, they were men hired to hurt people, and they were very good at their jobs. At the center of the formation stood a man who clearly led them. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead, his face all sharp angles and aristocratic lines. His suit was immaculate, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, with a burgundy tie that probably cost more than Pamela made in a month. He carried a black leather briefcase in his left hand, and when he stepped forward, the other men parted like water around a stone. His eyes swept the diner with the practiced efficiency of someone conducting reconnaissance. They passed over the college kids who'd stopped mid-sentence and were staring openly. Over the elderly couple who'd set down their forks. Over Eddie, who'd gone very still at the counter, his hand frozen halfway to his coffee cup. Then the man's gaze landed on Pamela and stopped. She stood there, coffee pot still raised, feeling suddenly exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her heart hammered in her chest. Her throat felt tight. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The silver-haired man walked toward her with measured steps, his shoes clicking against the linoleum with metronomic precision. The bodyguards remained by the door. The suited men fanned out slightly, taking positions that seemed casual but blocked every exit. The front door, the kitchen, even the emergency exit near booth 7. Pamela became aware of how silent the diner had become. She could hear the rain against the windows, the hum of the refrigerator, her own rapid breathing. The man stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Expensive, woody, understated, and see the fine lines around his eyes. "Are you Miss Pamela Richard?" His voice was cultured, precise, with the faintest trace of an East Coast accent that had been professionally smoothed but not entirely erased. Pamela's mouth was dry. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. Not sympathy, exactly, but acknowledgement. "My name is Samuel Leone. I am the legal counsel for Mr. Herbert Franklin." He paused, and in that pause, Pamela felt her entire world tilt on its axis. "Mr. Franklin passed away this morning at 6:47 a.m. You are formally requested to come with us." The coffee pot slipped from Pamela's hand. It hit the floor with a crash that seemed impossibly loud, ceramic shattering, hot coffee splashing across the linoleum and soaking into her shoes. She barely felt it. Passed away. The words echoed in her skull, each syllable a hammer blow. Herbert Franklin was dead. The man she'd served pie to, the man she'd cut toast for, the man who'd left her cryptic gifts and talked about loyalty and betrayal and friends who were buried, he was gone. She'd known. On some level, she'd known since Tuesday night when the bell didn't ring, since Wednesday when she'd seen that white rose on his doorstep. But knowing and knowing were two different things. Her voice came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat, tried again. I don't understand. Why do you need me? Samuel Leone's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps? Or assessment. All will be explained, but not here. He glanced around the diner, at the customers who were now openly staring, at Lonnie who'd appeared from the kitchen and stood frozen by the grill. This is not the appropriate venue for the discussion we need to have. Discussion about what? Pamela's voice was rising now, panic bleeding through. I was his waitress. I just served him dinner. I don't know anything about... Miss Richard. Leone's voice cut through her spiraling words like a blade. Not harsh, but firm. You were named specifically, by name, in Mr. Franklin's final instructions. He shifted the briefcase to his other hand. I understand this is unexpected. I understand you're confused. But I assure you, your presence is not optional. It's required. The last word hung in the air like a threat. Pamela looked past Leone to the 10 men in suits, the 4 bodyguards by the door. She thought about making a scene, about refusing, about calling the police. But something in Leone's tone, in the way those men stood with military precision, told her that resistance would be pointless. This wasn't a request. It was a summons. She looked down at the shattered coffee pot, the spreading pool of dark liquid that reflected the fluorescent lights. Her apron was soaked. Her hands were shaking. Am I? She had to force the words out. Am I in trouble? For the first time, Leone's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy. No, Miss Richard, you're not in trouble, but Mr. Franklin's affairs are complex and time-sensitive. We need you to come with us now. Pamela's mind raced. Herbert had died this morning. Not Tuesday. This morning. He'd been gone for less than 12 hours, and already lawyers and bodyguards were showing up to collect her. What kind of man died and had this kind of response? She thought about the articles she'd read. Herbert the Rose Franklin, alleged enforcer, organized crime. Everything I own for a reason, and everything I give away for a reason too. Pam? Lonnie's voice came from behind her, uncertain. You okay? You want me to call someone? She turned. Lonnie stood by the grill, a spatula in his hand, looking between her and the wall of suited men like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Eddie had slid off his stool and was standing now, his body language suggesting he was ready to intervene even though he clearly had no idea what was happening. It's... Pamela's voice cracked. She tried again. It's okay, Lonnie. I need to go. You sure? His eyes flicked to Leone. Because I can call the cops if... That won't be necessary. Leone's voice wasn't threatening, but it carried absolute authority. Miss Richard is coming of her own free will. Isn't that correct, Miss Richard? It wasn't a question. It was a script she was expected to follow. Pamela nodded numbly. Yeah, I need to go. She untied her apron with trembling fingers, her movements mechanical. The fabric was soaked with coffee, heavy and cold. She set it on the counter, next to the register, next to the tip jar with its crumpled bills and loose change. Everything looked surreal suddenly. The diner with its worn booths, the customers frozen mid-meal, Eddie and Lonnie watching with confused concern. This was her life. This was where she worked, where she spent 60 hours a week, where she'd built a small, safe existence out of routine and predictability. And now these men in suits had walked in and shattered it as completely as that coffee pot on the floor. Leone gestured toward the door. "My car is outside." Pamela walked toward the entrance on legs that didn't feel like her own. The suited men parted as she approached, forming a corridor. Up close, she could see the small details that marked them as professionals. The communication devices in their ears, the way they carried their weight, the absolute awareness in their eyes. These weren't lawyers, or if they were lawyers who'd learned to be something else. As she passed through the doorway into the cold November drizzle, she heard the whispers start behind her. The college kids muttering to each other. The elderly couple's shocked voices. Eddie asking Lonnie what the hell just happened. Outside, parked directly in front of the diner, was a black SUV. Not just any SUV, an armored Suburban with tinted windows, the kind that screamed government or military or organized crime. Rain beaded on its polished surface, running down the windows in rivulets. One of the bodyguards opened the rear door. Pamela stopped. The interior of the vehicle was dark, leather seats barely visible in the dim light from the street lamp. Getting in that car felt like stepping off a cliff. "Miss Richard." Leone had appeared beside her, somehow producing an umbrella that he held over both their heads. "I understand you're frightened, but I give you my word. You are in no danger. Mr. Franklin wanted to provide for you. That's all this is." "Provide for me?" Pamela turned to look at him, rain misting her face. "I served him pie. Why would he?" "Because you showed him kindness when no one else did." Leone's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. "And to Herbert Franklin, that meant everything." Before she could respond, he gestured to the open door. "Please, we have a great deal to discuss, and very little time." Pamela looked back at the diner one last time. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see Lonnie on the phone, probably calling Ray, telling him something insane was happening. She could see her apron still on the counter, could see booth 7 empty in the back corner. Herbert's booth. She thought about the locket, the cigarettes, the photograph of the rose garden, the address on the back, 49 Harbor Street. Don't let them take it. She didn't know what Herbert had left her, didn't know what any of this meant, but standing in the rain with 10 suited men and 4 bodyguards surrounding a vehicle that looked like it could survive an airstrike, Pamela Richard understood with absolute clarity that her small, safe life was over. She got in the car. The door closed behind her with a solid thunk that sounded horribly final. The interior smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Leone slid in beside her. 2 bodyguards took the front seats. Through the tinted windows, she watched the other men disperse to different vehicles, 3 more SUVs that had been parked nearby, invisible until now. The engine started with a whisper. As they pulled away from the Rusty Spoon diner, Pamela pressed her hand against the cold window and watched the neon sign fade into the rain-soaked darkness. And whispered, "What did you do, Mr. Franklin? What the hell did you do?" The drive lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Pamela sat rigid in the leather seat, acutely aware of Samuel Leone beside her and the 2 silent bodyguards in front. No one spoke. The only sounds were the whisper of the engine, the rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers, and the muted static of a radio communication device somewhere in the front seat. She watched the city slide past through tinted windows, familiar streets rendered alien by darkness and rain. They crossed into downtown, where the buildings grew taller and the streets cleaner, where the homeless disappeared and the storefronts displayed prices without numbers. Old money territory, the kind of neighborhood where Pamela had only ever been to clean offices or deliver takeout. The SUV turned down a side street and pulled up in front of a building that looked like it had been transplanted from 19th century London. 4 stories of dark brick and limestone, with ornate cornices and tall windows that glowed with warm light. A brass plaque beside the entrance read, Leone and Associates, established 1952. No neon signs, no advertisements, just understated wealth and power that didn't need to announce itself. The bodyguard opened her door. Pamela stepped out into the drizzle, her diner uniform suddenly feeling shabby and inappropriate. She was still wearing her coffee-stained shoes. Leone appeared beside her with the umbrella. "This way, please." They walked up marble steps, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The entrance door, heavy wood reinforced with brass, opened before they reached it, held by a young man in a perfectly pressed suit who nodded respectfully at Leone and didn't even glance at Pamela. Inside, the building smelled of old wood, leather, and the kind of money that had been around so long it had stopped thinking of itself as money at all. The lobby was small, but immaculate. Dark wood paneling, a Persian rug that probably cost more than Pamela's car, sconces with actual Edison bulbs casting warm light across oil paintings of stern-faced men in judicial robes. A grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner, its brass pendulum swinging with metronomic precision. "Second floor," Leone said, gesturing toward a narrow staircase. Pamela climbed, her wet shoes squeaking slightly against the polished wood. Behind her, she heard the subtle sounds of the bodyguards taking positions, one at the door, one at the base of the stairs, securing the perimeter, making sure she couldn't leave even if she wanted to. The second floor was a single long hallway lined with closed doors bearing brass nameplates. Leone led her to the end, to a door marked conference room, private, and opened it. Pamela stepped inside and stopped. The room was exactly what she'd expected, and somehow worse than she'd imagined. Dark wood paneling, floor to ceiling, a conference table that could seat 20, its surface polished to a mirror shine, leather chairs that probably cost more than a month of her rent, bookshelves lined with legal volumes bound in burgundy and gold, their spines embossed with titles she couldn't read from this distance. And men. 5 of them, already seated at the table. They looked up as she entered, and Pamela felt herself being assessed, catalogued, judged. These weren't lawyers in the public defender sense. These were men who represented the kind of clients whose names appeared in the society pages and sometimes in sealed court documents. They wore watches that gleamed gold in the lamplight. Their suits were handmade. Their expressions were carved from ice. Leone pulled out a chair for her, the one at the head of the table, directly opposite an empty seat that was clearly meant for him. "Please, Miss Richard, sit." She sat, feeling like a child called to the principal's office. The leather chair creaked softly under her weight. Her hands found her lap, where she twisted them together, trying to stop the shaking. Leone took his position at the opposite end. He set his briefcase on the table with a soft thud, clicked the latches open, and began removing documents. Thick folders bound with black ribbon, envelopes sealed with red wax, pages covered in dense legal text. "Gentlemen," Leone said, his voice formal now, official. "Miss Pamela Richard, as requested. Miss Richard, these are my associates who will be witnessing and notarizing today's proceedings." He gestured to each man in turn, rattling off names and titles that Pamela immediately forgot. "We're here regarding the last will and testament of Herbert David Franklin, who passed this morning at 6:47 a.m. at St. Benedict's Hospice." Hospice. The word hit her like a slap. Herbert had been dying, actually dying, and he'd never said a word. Leone opened the first folder. Before we begin, I need to verify your identity. Do you have identification with you? Pamela fumbled for her purse. She'd grabbed it on autopilot before leaving the diner and produced her driver's license with trembling fingers. Leone examined it briefly, then passed it to one of the associates, who made notes on a legal pad. Thank you. Leone returned the license. Now, Miss Richard, what I'm about to tell you will likely come as a shock. I ask that you refrain from interrupting until I've finished the formal reading. You'll have time for questions afterward. Do you understand? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Leone adjusted his reading glasses and lifted the first document. I, Herbert David Franklin, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, executed on the 15th of September, 2024. His voice took on the measured cadence of someone who'd done this many times before. I hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils. I appoint Samuel Leone of Leone and Associates as executor of my estate. He turned a page. To my estate, which includes but is not limited to financial assets, property holdings, business interests, and personal effects, I make the following distributions. Leone paused, his eyes lifting to meet Pamela's. To Miss Pamela Ann Richard of 47 Decker Street, Apartment 2B, I bequeath the following. Full control and chairmanship of the Franklin Foundation, a charitable trust with current assets valued at approximately $8 million. Full ownership and rights to the property located at 49 Harbor Street, including all structures, contents, and associated holdings. And a personal bequest of $500,000 to be distributed immediately upon probate. The room spun. $8 million. A property. $500,000. The numbers were so large they didn't feel real. They felt like words in a foreign language, sounds that had shape but no meaning. Pamela's voice came out as a croak. I don't understand. There must be a mistake. There is no mistake. Leone set down the document. Mr. Franklin was quite explicit, Matt. You are the sole beneficiary of his estate, Miss Richard. Everything he owned now belongs to you. But I was his waitress. The words burst out of her, desperate, confused. I just served him coffee. I cut his toast, that's all. Why would he? He said you were the only person left he could trust. Leone's voice was matter-of-fact, but the words landed like stones. Around the table, the other lawyers watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation. One man, late 50s, with silver temples and a gold Rolex that caught the light, exchanged a meaningful glance with the person beside him. Pamela saw it. The look. The silent communication that said, she has no idea what she's walking into. The Franklin Foundation, she said slowly, trying to grasp something concrete. What does it do? Leone folded his hands. Ostensibly, it's a charitable organization. It funds scholarships, community programs, veterans services, all legitimate, all documented. He paused. But the foundation also holds certain assets, properties, accounts, information, things that Mr. Franklin accumulated over a very long life. What kind of information? The kind that powerful people would prefer remained private. Leone's expression didn't change, but his tone sharpened. Mr. Franklin was a complex man, Miss Richard. He had relationships, business and personal, with individuals in various spheres of influence. Some of those relationships were documented, recorded, preserved. Understanding crept in like ice water. He kept records of crimes, of deals, of transactions. Leone corrected, but the distinction felt meaningless. Yes. Pamela looked down at her hands, still twisted in her lap. She thought about Herbert's gifts. The locket, his wife's. The woman with the soft heart who'd gotten her killed. The cigarettes, vintage, valuable, a piece of history. The photograph of the rose garden at 49 Harbor Street. Everything I own for a reason. And everything I give away for a reason too. He'd been preparing her, testing her, making sure she'd come here, to this room, to this moment. "Why me?" she whispered. He must have had family, friends, people who actually knew him. "His family is dead," Leon said flatly. "His wife passed in 2004. No children, no siblings. His associates," he gestured vaguely. "Most are deceased. The ones who aren't wouldn't be suitable stewards of his legacy. Because they're criminals."
"Because they lack your particular qualification." Leon leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Franklin believed you were kind without agenda, that you saw him as human when everyone else saw a monster," he said. Leon consulted the document again. "She gave me dignity when I deserved none. That's worth more than loyalty bought with fear." Pamela's eyes stung. She blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of these men. Leon slid a stack of documents across the polished table. "These require your signature: standard inheritance paperwork, transfer of assets, assumption of the foundation chairmanship. My associates will notarize everything." She stared at the papers. Page after page of dense legal text, words like hereafter and whereas and in perpetuity. At the bottom of each page, a red tab marked "Sign here." "What if I say no?" Her voice was small. "Then the estate goes to the state of New Jersey, the foundation dissolves, and everything Mr. Franklin built, the legitimate parts and otherwise, becomes public record." Leon's expression was unreadable. Within a week, subpoenas would be issued. Within a month, trials would begin. Powerful men would be exposed. And some of them would be very, very angry about it. So either way, people are going to be angry. Yes, but if you accept the inheritance, you control what happens to that information. You have leverage, besides protection. He paused. "Mr. Franklin made arrangements, security, resources. He didn't leave you defenseless, Miss Richard." The man with the Rolex spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and urbane. "It should be noted that some of Mr. Franklin's former associates have expressed interest in his affairs. The estate, the foundation holdings." "Interest," Pamela repeated. "You mean they want what he left me?" "They want what Mr. Franklin knew," the man corrected, "and what he recorded. You now own that information, which means you own a considerable amount of power over certain individuals." Leonie shot him a look that could have frozen nitrogen. "Thank you, Marcus. Very helpful." Marcus shrugged, unrepentant. Pamela picked up a pen, heavy, expensive, probably worth more than her entire savings account. The tip hovered over the first signature line. "If I sign this," she said carefully, "what happens to me?" "You become wealthy," Leon said. "You become influential, and yes, you become a target." He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Franklin didn't give you an easy gift, Miss Richard. He gave you a burden, but he believed you were strong enough to carry it." She thought about Herbert in booth 7, struggling with his toast, his hands shaking with age and arthritis, and the weight of a lifetime's worth of violence. She thought about the way he'd looked at her that first time she'd helped him, really looked, like he was seeing something he'd forgotten existed. People don't do things they don't have to. Maybe they should. She'd meant it then. Small kindnesses, basic human decency, the things that cost nothing but meant everything. And now those small kindnesses had bought her an empire built on blood and secrets. Pamela's hand steadied. She pressed the pen to paper and signed her name. The scratch of ink against expensive paper was the only sound in the room. She moved through the stack methodically. 10 pages, 12, 15. Each signature felt like a door closing behind her, sealing her into a future she hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. When she finished, Leon gathered the documents with practiced efficiency. His associates produced stamps and seals, notarizing each page with ritual precision. There's one more thing. Leon reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small key on a silver chain. To the property at 49 Harbor Street. Mr. Franklin requested you visit it as soon as possible. He left something there for you, something that will explain, well, everything. Pamela took the key. It was warm from Leon's pocket, heavy in her palm. Some inheritances, Leon said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning. Come with enemies attached. Mr. Franklin certainly does. You should be aware that accepting this estate places you in considerable danger. Then why let me sign? Pamela's voice was sharper than she intended. Why not warn me before? Would you have believed me? Leon asked. Would you have understood the scope of what you were inheriting if I'd simply told you? He shook his head. Mr. Franklin knew you'd sign anyway. He said you had the kind of stubborn kindness that doesn't calculate odds. That's why he chose you. Around the table, the lawyers were packing their briefcases, preparing to leave, but the man with the Rolex remained seated, watching her with calculating eyes. Miss Richard, he said, a word of advice. From someone who knew Herbert Franklin for 30 years. Trust no one, not his friends, not his enemies, and certainly not anyone who claims to be acting in your best interest. His smile didn't reach his eyes, including us. Then he stood and walked out, leaving Pamela alone with Leon and the crushing weight of 8 million reasons to be terrified. Pamela waited until morning. She'd returned to her apartment near midnight, escorted by one of Leon's bodyguards, who'd insisted on checking every room before leaving her alone. She'd locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and sat on her bed with the key to 49 Harbor Street clutched in her fist until the sun rose. She didn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every sound from the street below sent her heart racing. Twice she'd gotten up to check that the chair was still in place. Once she'd called the diner, but it had gone to voicemail. Ray would be furious she'd abandoned her shift. But that seemed impossibly distant now, a problem from another life. By 7 a.m., exhaustion had given way to a strange, brittle clarity. She showered, dressed in jeans and a jacket, and stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at a face that looked the same but felt fundamentally altered. 24 hours ago, she'd been a waitress. Now she was, what? An heiress? A target? A keeper of secrets that could destroy powerful men. The key hung around her neck on its silver chain, hidden beneath her shirt. It felt heavier than it should, like it was made of lead instead of brass. At 8:30, she got in her car and drove toward the harbor. Harbor Street wasn't hard to find, but it felt like entering another world. The neighborhood sat at the edge of the industrial waterfront, where the city's gentrification efforts hadn't yet reached. Old warehouses with broken windows stood alongside abandoned factories, their brick facades stained with decades of smoke and salt air. The streets were potholed, lined with chain-link fences and construction equipment that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Number 49 stood at the end of a dead-end street, separated from its neighbors by overgrown lots, thick with weeds and trash. It was larger than the photograph had suggested, a 3-story Victorian mansion that had somehow survived a century of neglect and urban decay. The house loomed against the gray morning sky, like something from a ghost story, its dark silhouette edged by the pale light reflecting off the harbor beyond. Pamela parked across the street and sat with the engine running, studying the building. The mansion was grand in the way old money used to be grand, not flashy, but imposing. 3 stories of dark brick and weathered clapboard siding, with tall windows covered by heavy curtains and a wraparound porch sagging under the weight of rot and time. The roof looked intact, but ivy had claimed much of the eastern wall, crawling up past the second floor and threading through the gutters. The yard, if it could still be called that, was a jungle of dead grass, wild roses, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a garden. A wrought iron fence surrounded the property, 8 feet tall and topped with spear points. The gate stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the harbor breeze. Pamela killed the engine and stepped out into the cold morning air. It smelled of salt water and diesel fuel and something older, decay maybe, or just the weight of history that clung to places where bad things had happened. She approached the gate, her footsteps crunching on broken pavement. Up close, she could see details the photograph hadn't captured. The ornate scrollwork in the iron, now rusted but still elegant. The brass address numbers, 4 and 9, green with verdigris. The remains of what had been a beautiful rose garden, now overgrown and wild, but still blooming in defiance of neglect. White roses, just like in the photograph. Just like the one on Herbert's doorstep. My mother planted them, said white roses meant new beginnings, redemption. Pamela pushed through the gate and walked up the cracked stone path to the front porch. The steps groaned under her weight, and she tested each one carefully, half expecting the wood to give way. The front door was massive, dark mahogany with stained glass panels depicting roses and thorns. Appropriate, she thought, for a man called the Rose. She pulled the key from beneath her shirt and fitted it into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, as if someone had oiled it recently. The door swung inward with a long, mournful creak. Pamela stepped inside and stopped, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of frozen time. The interior of the house was a mausoleum. Dust covered every surface in a thick blanket, disturbed only by her footprints as she moved deeper inside. Furniture hulked beneath white sheets like sleeping ghosts. A couch in the parlor, chairs around a dining table, shapes she couldn't quite identify in the dim light filtering through the curtained windows. The air was thick and stale, but beneath the dust, she could smell other things: old wood, mothballs, leather, and something else that made her chest tighten: cigar smoke. Faint but unmistakable, as if Herbert had been here recently, sitting in the dark with one of his cigars, watching the street through those heavy curtains. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as she moved through the ground level. The parlor held furniture from another era, Victorian, ornate, expensive even in decay. The dining room's table could seat 12, its surface covered with decades of dust, and a single crystal chandelier hanging dark and cobwebbed above. The kitchen was surprisingly modern, updated sometime in the 80s or 90s, but abandoned, the refrigerator unplugged and standing open, the counters bare except for a single coffee cup sitting beside the sink. It was the cup that broke her heart, plain white ceramic, a ring of dried coffee, still visible inside. Herbert's last morning here, whenever that had been. His last cup of coffee before, what? Before he left for the hospice? Before he knew he was dying? Pamela climbed the stairs to the second floor, her hand trailing along a banister carved with roses. More bedrooms, more shrouded furniture. One room had clearly been Herbert's. A massive four-poster bed, a wardrobe standing open to reveal suits she recognized. Dark and formal, the same kind he'd worn to the diner. On the nightstand sat a photograph in a silver frame. Herbert and a woman, both young, both smiling. His wife, the woman from the locket. She looked happy. He looked human, not the stone-faced man Pamela had known, but someone softer, someone who'd believed in things like love and future and redemption. On the third floor, she found what must have been an office. A massive desk dominated the room, its surface cleared except for a telephone, rotary, ancient, and a leather blotter. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal volumes, histories of New Jersey, books on business and politics, and strangely, gardening. But it was the portrait above the fireplace that stopped her cold. Herbert Franklin, painted in oils, probably in his 40s. He sat in a leather chair wearing a dark suit, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. But it was his eyes that captured her. They stared out from the canvas with an intensity that felt alive, that seemed to follow her as she moved across the room. And there, visible on his neck, painted in perfect detail, the rose tattoo. This is who you really were. Malam, Pamela thought, not the old man in booth 7, but this. Power, control, fear. She descended back to the first floor, her unease growing. The house felt like a tomb, yes, but also like a trap. Beautifully appointed, carefully maintained, but designed to keep secrets. And she hadn't found them yet. The basement entrance was hidden behind a door in the kitchen that she'd initially mistaken for a pantry. When she opened it, stairs descended into darkness. She found a light switch, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, illuminating rough wooden steps leading down into shadow. The basement smelled of concrete and earth. It was unfinished, exposed beams overhead, stone walls, a packed dirt floor in some places. Boxes were stacked along the walls, covered with tarps. An old boiler squatted in the corner like a sleeping dragon. Pamela descended carefully, the stairs creaking under her weight. At the bottom, she pulled the string on another overhead bulb, and more of the space revealed itself. And there, along the far wall, she saw it, a section that didn't match. The stones were newer, the mortar less weathered, a false wall, and not particularly well hidden if you were looking for it. Her heart hammered as she approached. Up close, she could see the seam, a rectangle about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, with no visible handles or locks. She pressed against it experimentally, and it shifted. Not a wall, a door. She pushed harder, and the entire section swung inward with a grinding sound, revealing a small room beyond, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a single overhead light that flickered on automatically when the door opened. Pamela stepped inside and felt her breath leave her body. The room was meticulous, organized, an archive of carefully preserved secrets. Metal shelving units lined 3 walls filled with boxes labeled by year, 1970, 1980, 1980, continuing up to 2020. Each box was the same size, the same shape, sealed with tape and marked with codes she didn't understand. She pulled down the nearest box, 1982, and opened it. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them. Black composition books filled with entries in neat handwriting, recording transactions in a code she couldn't decipher, names, numbers, dates, locations. Beneath the ledgers were photographs, men in suits shaking hands, exchanging briefcases, standing outside buildings she recognized from the news. Politicians, police chiefs, judges, and among them, younger but unmistakable, Herbert Franklin. She opened another box, more ledgers, more photographs, but also cassette tapes labeled with dates and initials, recordings, evidence, box after box, year after year. A lifetime of documentation. Herbert hadn't just participated in organized crime, he'd recorded it. Every deal, every transaction, every dirty secret. He'd been building insurance, leverage, protection. Or maybe, she thought as she stared at the shelves, he'd been building a confession. On the floor in the center of the room sat a leather satchel, new and out of place among the decay. Pamela knelt beside it and unzipped it with trembling fingers. Inside were bundles of cash, hundreds, maybe $50,000 total. A passport with her photograph, but a different name. Car keys to a vehicle she'd never seen. A cell phone. Cell phone, prepaid. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope with her name written in Herbert's shaky handwriting. Miss Pamela Richard. She opened it with fumbling fingers. Inside was a single page, handwritten, the letters uneven but legible. Pamela, if you're reading this, I'm gone. That's probably for the best. I've lived too long already, seen too much, done things that stain whatever soul I might have had left. You showed me kindness when no one else did. You saw me as a man, not a monster. I don't know why you did that. Maybe you're foolish. Maybe you're just good. But it changed something in me in these last months. Made me remember there were parts of myself I'd buried so deep I thought they were dead. The world I'm leaving you is dangerous. The information in this room can destroy powerful men, some still living, some with sons and grandsons who've inherited their father's sins. They will come for it. They will come for you. But I've made arrangements. Samuel Leone has instructions, resources, protection. You're not as alone as you feel right now. The foundation money is clean. Use it however you want. The property is yours to keep or sell. But what's in these boxes, that's your choice. You can destroy it, release it, use it as leverage. You can make right what I made wrong, or you can burn it all and walk away. I won't judge you either way. I've done enough judging for 10 lifetimes. Thank you for cutting my toast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for treating an old killer like he was human. That kindness, Miss Richard, is the one thing I couldn't buy, couldn't steal, couldn't force. And in the end, it was the only thing that mattered. Don't let them take this from you. Not the money, not the property, but the choice. That's what I'm really leaving you, the power to choose what happens next. Be careful, be smart, and for God's sake, don't trust anyone who says they're doing things in my name. Herbert Franklin. The letter blurred as tears filled Pamela's eyes. They fell onto the paper, smearing the ink, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. Herbert Franklin, the rose, a killer, a criminal. A man who'd built an empire on fear and violence. And in the end, he'd given it all to a waitress who'd shown him dignity when he deserved none. She didn't know how long she sat there, crying in that concrete room surrounded by decades of documented crime. It might have been minutes. It might have been an hour. Finally, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She stood, wiping her eyes, and looked around the room with new understanding. This wasn't just evidence. This was Herbert's redemption. His chance to make right what he'd spent a lifetime making wrong. And he'd given that chance to her. The weight of it was crushing. She turned to leave, to go back upstairs and figure out what the hell she was supposed to do next. And froze. Through the small basement window at ground level, she could see the street. A black sedan was parked across from her car. Engine running, exhaust visible in the cold morning air. The windows were tinted, but she could see the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. Watching, waiting. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. A text from an unknown number. Leave through the back, now. Red Honda in the alley. Keys under the mat. Drive to the address programmed in the GPS. Don't go home. S.L. Samuel Leone. Pamela's hands shook as she shoved the letter into her jacket and zipped the satchel. She took one last look at the shelves of secrets, then killed the light and closed the false wall behind her. Outside, the black sedan's door opened. Someone was coming, and Pamela Richard, who'd served coffee and cut toast and never hurt anyone in her entire life, ran. The red Honda was exactly where Leone said it would be. Keys under the mat, GPS already programmed with a single destination. Safe location, 7 minutes. Pamela didn't look back as she peeled out of the alley, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel, Herbert's satchel wedged between her feet. In the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of a figure emerging from the mansion's front entrance. Dark coat, purposeful stride, before she turned the corner and they disappeared from view. The GPS led her through a maze of industrial streets, then onto the highway heading north. She drove 15 miles over the speed limit, checking her mirrors obsessively, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every black sedan looked threatening. Every SUV with tinted windows might be following her. The safe location turned out to be an extended stay hotel off exit 13, the kind of anonymous mid-range place where business travelers stayed and no one asked questions. Pamela parked in the back lot, grabbed the satchel, and walked to room 2C with the key card that had been tucked into the car's sun visor. Inside, the room was generic and clean. 2 double beds, a desk, a bathroom that smelled of industrial cleanser. On the desk sat a burner phone with a sticky note. "Call me, SL." She called. Leone answered on the first ring. "Are you hurt?" "No. Who was that? Who was watching the house?" "We're not certain yet. Could be Moretti's people. Could be someone else." His voice was tense. "Stay there. Don't go home. Don't contact anyone from your old life. I'll have supplies brought to you within the hour." "For how long?" "As long as it takes." A pause. "You read the letter?" "Yes." "Then you understand what you're holding. And you understand why people will kill for it." The line went dead. For 3 days, Pamela lived in that hotel room like a ghost. Supplies arrived as promised. A suitcase of clothes in her size, toiletries, prepaid credit cards, a laptop with encrypted access to the foundation's accounts. She spent hours scrolling through financial records she barely understood, trying to comprehend the scope of what Herbert had built. $8 million in the foundation. Another $3 million in property holdings, investments, trusts. All legitimate on the surface, all tied to the secrets hidden in that basement. She didn't sleep well. Every footstep in the hallway made her freeze. Every car engine in the parking lot sent her to the window, peering through the curtains at shadows that might or might not be threats. On the 4th day, Leon called. "It's time. We need to talk about next steps." They met at a diner 40 miles from the hotel, not the Rusty Spoon, but close enough in spirit that the familiarity was painful. Pamela slid into a booth at the back, and Leon appeared moments later, sliding a manila folder across the table. "What's this?" Background on the people who appear most frequently in Herbert's records, the ones who have the most to lose, if that information becomes public. He opened the folder, revealing photographs and dossiers. Vincent Moretti, you've heard that name. He was Herbert's associate in the 70s and 80s. Now he's 83, officially retired, but still influential in certain circles. Then there's Richard Castellano, former police commissioner, currently a consultant to the mayor's office, and Anthony Martinelli, who now sits on the New Jersey State Senate. Pamela studied the faces, men in their 60s and 70s now, respectable and gray-haired, with smiling family photographs and civic awards. But in Herbert's old photographs, they'd been young and hungry and dirty. They all know about the ledgers? They know Herbert kept records. They've always known. For decades, that knowledge kept them in line. No one moved against Herbert. Because he had insurance. Leon's expression darkened. But now Herbert's dead, and they want to know where that insurance went. They know I have it. They know you inherited the estate. They don't know how much you know or what you have access to. That uncertainty is currently your best protection. They're trying to assess the threat. Before they act, he leaned forward. But that won't last. Eventually, someone will make a move, and you need to decide what you're going to do before that happens. Pamela stared at the photographs. What were Herbert's instructions? What did he want me to do with all this? He left that decision to you, deliberately. Leon's voice softened slightly. He said you were the first person he'd met in 40 years who wasn't corrupted or corruptible, that you'd know the right thing to do when the time came. "I don't know the right thing to do," Pamela whispered. "I'm a waitress. I serve coffee. I can't." Her voice broke. Leon waited, saying nothing, letting her find her words. "If I expose everything," she continued shakily, "these men go down. But how many other people get hurt? How many families get destroyed because their grandfather or father made bad choices 50 years ago? How many careers end? How many reputations shatter?" She looked up at him. And if I don't expose it, if I just keep it quiet, then what was the point? Herbert's redemption becomes just another cover-up. There's a third option, Leon said carefully. You could use it as leverage, make deals, negotiate, force these men to do the right thing going forward in exchange for their past staying buried. Blackmail. Pragmatism. Pamela laughed, a bitter sound. So I become what Herbert was, just a better version of it. Or you become what Herbert wanted to be. Someone who uses power to protect instead of destroy. Leon closed the folder. There's no clean answer here, Miss Richard. That's the burden he left you. The choice between justice and mercy, between truth and peace. That night, Pamela went home. Leon had advised against it, but she couldn't hide forever. She needed clothes, personal items, some connection to the life she'd had before all of this. She needed to feel normal, even if just for an hour. Her apartment building looked the same, shabby, familiar, safe. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, her keys already out, and stopped. Her door was slightly ajar, not broken, not forced, just open. Half an inch, light from inside spilling into the hallway. Every instinct screamed at her to run. Instead, she pushed the door wider and stepped inside. Nothing looked disturbed. The furniture was where it belonged. Her laptop sat on the coffee table. The TV was still mounted on the wall. Whoever had been here hadn't come to steal. Then she saw it. Her coffee mug, the one she'd left in the sink that morning, now sat on the kitchen counter, washed, dried, positioned perfectly in the center, like a centerpiece, like a message. We were here. We could have taken you. But we didn't. Yet. Pamela's phone rang, making her jump. Unknown number. She answered with a trembling hand. Miss Richard. The voice was male, older, rough with cigarettes and age. My name is Vincent Moretti. I believe you have something that belongs to me. The ledgers belong to me. She forced strength into her voice. Herbert left them to me. Herbert was a sentimental fool in his old age, making a waitress his heir, leaving her everything. A raspy laugh. You don't understand what you're holding, sweetheart. Those records could put a lot of people in prison, could destroy families, could start wars. Then maybe those people should be in prison. You think it's that simple? You think justice is just locking up old men for shit they did when Nixon was president? His voice hardened. Those records also implicate people who weren't criminals. Cops who looked the other way, lawyers who cut deals, judges who signed warrants they knew were dirty. You release Herbert's confession. You don't just take down the bad guys, you take down everyone. Pamela's throat tightened. What do you want? I want to meet, talk, make a deal that doesn't end with you dead in an alley or me spending my last years in a cell. I think Herbert would want that. Peace. Not more bodies. How do I know you won't just kill me? Because if I wanted you dead, you'd be dead already. I know where you work, where you live. Hell, I know you like vanilla creamer in your coffee and you're 3 months behind on your electric bill. A pause. I'm not your enemy, Miss Richard. I'm the guy trying to keep you alive long enough to make a smart choice. The line went dead. Pamela stood in her violated apartment, staring at the coffee mug that had been moved just enough to prove they could reach her any time they wanted. She thought about Herbert's letter. Don't let them take this from you. Not the money, not the property, but the choice. Her phone buzzed. A text from Leon. Leave, now. they're tracking you. Another text, different number. There's a white rose on your bed. Consider it a final warning. VM. Pamela walked to her bedroom on shaking legs. There, placed carefully on her pillow, was a single white rose. Fresh, perfect, thorns removed, redemption, or a threat. She grabbed a bag, stuffed it with clothes, and ran. Behind her, in the apartment that no longer felt like sanctuary, the rose lay waiting, beautiful and terrible, a reminder that even kindness came with a price, when you inherited a dead man's sins. And somewhere in the city, men who'd spent decades burying their crimes were deciding whether Pamela Richard was a problem they could negotiate with or a threat they needed to eliminate. The shadows were closing in, and she was running out of places to hide. The meeting was set for midnight, Warehouse 7, Pier 43, the same address Leon had found, mentioned 3 times in Herbert's final correspondence. The same location that appeared in a photograph from 1981, showing Herbert and a younger Vincent Moretti standing beside a shipment container, both men smiling like they owned the world. Leone had forbidden her to go. "It's suicide," he'd said over the burner phone. "Moretti doesn't want to negotiate. He wants to intimidate you into giving up the ledgers, and if that doesn't work, he'll make you disappear." "Then why not just kill me? Why go through this theater?" "Because he needs to know what you've done with the information, who you've told, what copies exist. He needs you alive long enough to answer those questions." A pause, "And then he'll kill you." But Pamela had made her decision. She was tired of running, tired of hiding in hotel rooms, tired of checking every shadow for threats. Herbert had left her this burden, this terrible gift, and she was going to see it through. Not because she was brave, but because she was exhausted and angry, and because somewhere in the last week she'd stopped being just a waitress and become something else, someone who'd inherited a war. She arrived at Pier 43 at 11:45 p.m., driving the red Honda through a landscape of rusted shipping containers and abandoned warehouses. The harbor stretched dark and oily beyond, reflecting the lights of the city like broken glass. Somewhere out there, a foghorn moaned. Warehouse 7 loomed at the end of a potholed access road, 3 stories of corrugated metal and broken windows. A single security light illuminated the entrance, casting everything else in deep shadow. 2 black SUVs were parked near the loading dock, their engines off but their occupants surely inside, waiting. Pamela parked 50 yards away and sat with the engine running, her hands gripping the wheel. In her jacket pocket was a small digital recorder, not hidden but openly carried. She'd decided on transparency, honesty, the same kind of straightforward decency she'd shown Herbert when she'd cut his toast without being asked. If it had worked on a killer, maybe it would work on his former associates. Or maybe she was about to die. At 11:58, she turned off the engine, grabbed Herbert's satchel from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the cold November night. Her footsteps echoed across the concrete as she walked toward the warehouse. The security light buzzed overhead, attracting moths that threw wild shadows across the walls. Somewhere nearby, water lapped against the pilings, and metal creaked in the wind. The warehouse door stood open. Pamela stepped inside and stopped, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The space was vast and empty, stripped of whatever cargo it had once held. Metal support beams rose toward a ceiling lost in darkness. Chains hung from overhead tracks, swaying slightly. At the far end, industrial lights had been set up, creating a pool of harsh illumination that looked like a stage. And on that stage stood Vincent Moretti. He was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 5'8", his once powerful frame stooped with age. He wore an expensive overcoat and leather gloves, his white hair combed back from a face that had been handsome once, but was now a ruin of wrinkles and liver spots. But his eyes were sharp, cold, calculating. The eyes of a man who'd spent 70 years making other people afraid. He wasn't alone. 10 men flanked him, not suited lawyers like Leon's associates, but something rougher. Younger men with dead eyes and the casual stance of people comfortable with violence. One leaned against a support beam, arms crossed. Another stood by a side door, blocking the exit. The rest formed a loose semicircle behind Moretti, their presence a physical threat that needed no words. Pamela walked forward, her shoes clicking on concrete, until she stood at the edge of the light, close enough to talk, far enough to run if she needed to, though running wouldn't help. Not here. Not surrounded. Miss Richard? Moretti's voice was exactly as it had been on the phone, rough, tired, edged with cigarette damage. Brave of you to come alone. I'm not alone. She kept her voice steady. People know where I am. Samuel Leon, you mean? Herbert's pet lawyer? Moretti smiled, showing yellowed teeth. Yeah, I'm sure he's got the FBI on speed dial, just waiting to swoop in. Except we both know that ain't happening, because if the feds get involved, all those secrets come out, and Leon's got clients who'd be real unhappy about that. He took a step closer, and Pamela fought the urge to step back. You got something that belongs to me, sweetheart. Records, ledgers, tapes, Herbert's insurance policy. Another step. I want them, all of them, original copies, backups, everything. They're not yours. They belong to the foundation, to me. Moretti laughed, a sound like gravel in a disposal. You think you can hold what Herbert built? You're 29 years old. You serve coffee for a living. You got no idea what you're sitting on. I know exactly what I'm sitting on. Pamela's voice was stronger now, fueled by anger that was burning through her fear. 50 years of crimes, murders, bribes, extortion, politicians on the take, cops who looked the other way, all documented, all proven, all ancient history. Moretti spread his hands. Statute of limitations ran out on 90% of it. And the rest? You drag it into the light. You don't just hurt me. You hurt a lot of people who were trying to survive in a dirty world. You hurt families. Kids and grandkids who never did nothing wrong except have the bad luck to be related to the wrong people. Is that supposed to make me feel sorry for you? It's supposed to make you smart. His voice hardened. I'm offering you a deal, $5 million, cash, delivered wherever you want. In exchange, you give me the ledgers, you dissolve the foundation, and you walk away. You get to live. You get to be rich. You get to forget you ever met Herbert Franklin. Pamela felt the weight of the recorder in her pocket. She thought about Herbert's letter. Don't let them take this from you. And if I say no? Moretti's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind his eyes. Then you're making a choice you can't take back. One of the younger men shifted, his hand moving toward his jacket, not pulling anything yet, just reminding her what was available if negotiations failed. "Herbert trusted me," Pamela said quietly. "Not you, not your friends, not the people who spent 40 years covering their asses. He trusted a waitress who cut his toast and didn't ask for anything in return." She met Moretti's gaze. "That should tell you something." "It tells me he went senile." Moretti's patience was fraying. "It tells me he forgot how the world actually works. It tells me he made a mistake thinking kindness means shit when you're dealing with wolves." "Maybe, but I'm the one holding the ledgers, so I guess his mistake is now your problem." The warehouse went silent except for the creak of metal and the distant sound of water. Moretti stared at her for a long moment, and Pamela saw him recalculating, reassessing. He'd expected fear, expected capitulation, expected her to fold under pressure like normal people did when confronted with violence. Instead, he'd gotten a waitress who'd spent 4 months watching an old killer struggle with his toast and had learned something about dignity in the process. "You know what Herbert's real talent was?" Moretti said finally. "Knowing when to cut his losses, when to walk away, when to make the smart play instead of the brave one." He gestured to his men. "You ain't him. You're just a kid playing at being gangster, so I'm gonna give you one last chance to be smart." "No." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Moretti's expression went flat. "Then we're done talking." The younger men moved, spreading out, cutting off her angles of escape. Pamela's heart hammered, but she reached into her jacket pocket, slowly, carefully, and pulled out the digital recorder. She held it up so everyone could see it. "This has been recording since I walked in," she said, her voice shaking now but determined. "Every word, every threat, everything." Moretti went very still. "You think a recording scares me? I've been recorded 100 times. Doesn't mean shit without a witness willing to testify." "You're right." Pamela's finger hovered over the stop button. "That's why I'm not the only one listening." She pressed a button on the recorder. Not stop, but a hidden trigger that Herbert's letter had instructed her to activate if she was ever in danger. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the side doors exploded inward. FBI agents poured into the warehouse, 20, 30 more. Wearing tactical gear, weapons drawn, voices overlapping in sharp commands. "Federal agents, on the ground, hands where we can see them. Now!" The young men around Moretti scattered, but there was nowhere to go. More agents appeared from the shadows near the loading dock, from behind the shipping containers, from positions they'd held for the last hour. Laser sights cut through the dusty air like red threads. Moretti stood frozen, his hands slowly rising, his face a mask of shock and fury. Pamela backed away as agents swept past her, securing the warehouse, cuffing Moretti's men, shouting commands that echoed off the metal walls. Someone grabbed her arm, an agent in tactical gear, and pulled her toward the entrance, toward safety, toward the flashing lights of 24 federal vehicles that had surrounded the warehouse. In the chaos, as Moretti was being forced to his knees, he caught her eye across the warehouse floor. "You stupid bitch!" he snarled. "You just declared war." "No," Pamela said, her voice steady now, clear. "Herbert declared war. 40 years ago. I'm just finishing it." Outside, wrapped in a blanket that an EMT had draped over her shoulders, Pamela watched as Moretti and his associates were loaded into federal vehicles, Charges were being shouted: conspiracy, extortion, attempted intimidation of a federal witness. More would come once they started processing the ledgers. Samuel Leone appeared beside her, his expression unreadable. "You could have told me about Herbert's arrangement with the FBI." "I didn't know until I read his letter the second time." She pulled the blanket tighter. He'd already set it up, years ago, a dead man's switch. If anything happened to him, if anyone threatened his heir, everything would be activated. Immunity agreements, protection, federal involvement, all of it. He used you as bait. He used me as a trigger. Pamela looked at Leone. He wanted them to come after me, wanted them to threaten me on record, with witnesses, wanted them to expose themselves. She laughed, a sound halfway between hysteria and wonder. Even dead, he was 3 moves ahead. Leone was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do now? The foundation is yours, the property, the fortune. And now the FBI has everything they need to take down everyone in those ledgers." Pamela watched the taillights of the federal vehicles disappear into the night. She thought about Herbert struggling with his toast, about kindness that cost nothing but meant everything, about the choice between justice and mercy, between exposure and protection. "I'm going to finish what he started," she said quietly. "I'm going to use the foundation to help people, really help them. And I'm going to make sure that everyone who deserves to answer for their crimes does. But," she paused, "but I'm also going to protect the people who don't deserve to have their lives destroyed because of their grandfather's sins." "That's a difficult balance." "Yeah," she looked at him. "But I'm a waitress. I'm good at balancing things." Leone smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time since she'd met him. In the distance, sirens echoed across the harbor. The city sparkled beyond the warehouses, indifferent to the small war that had just ended on its docks. And Pamela Richard, who'd inherited a dead man's empire, stood in the cold November night and wondered if Herbert Franklin, wherever he was, knew that his final gambit had worked, that kindness had won. That redemption, however late, was still possible, even for men called the Rose. 10 days after the warehouse, Pamela returned to the Rusty Spoon Diner. Not to work. Ray had fired her via voicemail, his voice alternating between fury and confusion about federal agents and abandoning shifts, but because she needed to see it again. The place where everything had started. The place where she'd met a man who'd changed her life by simply sitting in booth 7 and struggling with his toast. The diner looked exactly the same. The neon sign still flickered, the vinyl booths were still cracked, the air still smelled of burnt coffee, and decades of cigarette smoke that no amount of cleaning could erase. Through the window, she could see Denise working the counter, Lonnie visible through the kitchen pass-through, the world continuing as if nothing had happened, as if Pamela's entire existence hadn't been split into before and after. She stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, hands shoved in her jacket pockets, and realized she couldn't go inside. Not yet. Too many memories, too much grief for a man she'd barely known but who'd trusted her with everything that mattered. "Miss Richard." She turned. Samuel Leone stood beside a black sedan, wearing his immaculate charcoal suit despite the early hour. In his hands was a small velvet box, deep blue, the kind that held jewelry or other precious things. Mr. Leone. She walked toward him, suddenly nervous. Is everything okay? Did something happen with the case? The case is proceeding exactly as Herbert planned. Leone's expression was softer than she'd ever seen it. Moretti and 4 others have been formally charged. 3 more are cooperating in exchange for reduced sentences. The dominoes are falling exactly as Herbert orchestrated. He paused. I'm here about something else, something personal. He held out the velvet box. Pamela took it with trembling fingers. It was heavier than she expected, solid, substantial. A small envelope was attached to the top with her name written in Herbert's familiar, shaky handwriting. She opened the envelope first, her breath catching as she recognized the cadence of his words, even in written form. Pamela, if Samuel is giving you this, then you survived. You were smart enough, brave enough, strong enough to see it through. I knew you would be. That's why I chose you. This is my final gift, not money, not property. Not leverage or power or any of the things I spent my life accumulating. This is the place where you first saw Mimi as a man, not a monster, where you cut my toast without being asked, where you listened when I talked about loyalty and betrayal and all the friends I'd buried, where, for a few months at the end of a very long and very dark road, I got to be something other than what I'd made myself. I bought this place 6 weeks before I died, paid cash, had the deed transferred quietly. The owner didn't ask questions. People rarely did when I made them the right offer. It's yours now. Do with it what you want. Burn it down if it brings bad memories. Sell it and take the money. Or keep it and make it something better than it was. But if you keep it, do me one favor. Remember that kindness matters. That seeing people, really seeing them, can change everything. That sometimes the worst of us are just looking for someone to prove we're not beyond redemption. You proved that to me, Miss Richard. In booth 7, over coffee and pie and small talk that meant more than any conversation I'd had in 40 years. Thank you for that. Thank you for everything. Pamela's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and opened the velvet box. Inside, nestled in silk, was a brass key, simple, old-fashioned, worn smooth by use. Attached to it was a small brass tag engraved with an address she knew by heart. The Rusty Spoon Diner, 847 Route 9. And beneath the key, folded carefully, was the deed, transfer of ownership, from Herbert David Franklin to Pamela Ann Richard, dated September 20th, 6 weeks before he died, notarized, legal, irrevocable. Herbert had bought her the diner, the place where they'd met, the place where she'd worked herself to exhaustion for 4 years, the place where she'd shown him kindness without knowing who he was or what he'd done. He'd given her the diner. He purchased it outright, Leone said quietly, paid $300,000 cash. The previous owner was more than happy to sell. This place has been losing money for years. Herbert put the deed in a trust with instructions that it be transferred to you upon his death, regardless of what happened with the rest of the estate. Pamela stared at the key, her throat too tight to speak. He told me something when he made the arrangement, Leone continued. He said, I built my empire on fear and blood. I want my last act to be something different. I want to give her the one place where I was allowed to be human. those were his exact words. "I don't," Pamela's voice broke. "I don't know what to do with this." "You don't have to decide today, but Herbert believed you'd know the right thing when the time came. He was usually right about people." Leon smiled slightly. "It's one of the reasons he lived as long as he did. It took 3 weeks to make the decision. 3 weeks of paperwork with Leon. 3 weeks of working with the FBI as they processed the ledgers and built their cases. 3 weeks of sleeping better, knowing that Moretti was in federal custody and the men who'd threatened her were facing justice. 3 weeks of thinking about Herbert Franklin, the man who'd been both monster and human, who'd spent a lifetime creating fear, and his final months trying to buy back something he'd lost decades ago. Redemption. And when Pamela finally made her decision, it felt inevitable. Like Herbert had known all along what she'd choose. She reopened the diner on a cold December evening, exactly 2 months after Herbert's death. The renovations had been modest: new vinyl for the booths, fresh paint, a working air conditioner, floors stripped and refinished. She'd kept everything else the same: the counter, the stools, the kitchen equipment that Lonnie knew by heart. She'd even kept the old jukebox, though she'd had it repaired so it played without skipping. But she'd changed the sign. Where the rusty spoon had flickered in tired neon for 40 years, a new sign now glowed warm and steady. Franklin's Table, understated, elegant. A name that could mean anything to people who didn't know the story, but meant everything to those who did. Lonnie had agreed to come back as head cook. She'd tripled his salary using foundation money. Denise had declined, preferring to stay with Ray at his new location. But Pamela had hired 2 new servers, a single mother named Maria, who reminded her of herself, and a college kid named James, who needed flexible hours, and a boss who understood that sometimes people needed second chances. The opening was quiet. No grand announcement, no advertising, just the doors unlocked, the lights on, and the coffee brewing. By 7 p.m., a handful of customers had trickled in. Some old regulars who'd heard through the grapevine, some curious newcomers attracted by the fresh paint and new sign. They ordered coffee and burgers and pie, and Pamela moved between the tables with a grace born of muscle memory, her smile genuine for the first time in months. At 7:45, she walked to booth 7. It sat in the back corner by the emergency exit, exactly where it had always been. The vinyl was new but the same shade of red. The table was polished to a shine, and on it, Pamela placed a small brass placard that read, "Reserved, 8:00 p.m. Beside the placard, she set a white ceramic cup filled with black coffee, steam rising from its surface in delicate curls. No pie, no toast, just the coffee, the way Herbert had always taken it. At exactly 8 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. Not Herbert, of course, but an elderly couple looking for dinner. Pamela seated them in booth 3 and took their order, but her eyes kept drifting to booth 7. To the empty seat and the steaming coffee, and the reserved sign that would sit there every night at 8 o'clock for as long as she owned this place. A memorial, a reminder, a promise that kindness mattered even when, especially when, it was offered to people who didn't deserve it. At 9:30, after the dinner rush had died to a trickle, Pamela found herself standing beside booth 7, staring at the untouched coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Leon had stopped by earlier, checking in, making sure everything was running smoothly. He'd looked at booth 7, at the reserved sign and the cold coffee, and nodded once with something that might have been approval or might have been sadness. He would have liked this, Leon had said. The diner, the name, the gesture. He'd paused. He would have been proud of you, Miss Richard. Now that's alone in the quiet diner with just Lonnie clattering dishes in the kitchen and James wiping down tables, Pamela slid into booth 7. She sat where Herbert had sat for months, her back to the wall, facing the door, seeing the diner from his perspective. It looked different from here, smaller, more intimate. She understood why he'd chosen this spot. You could see everything, track everyone who came and went, position yourself for escape if necessary. Old habits from an old life. But maybe, toward the end, it had been something else. Maybe he'd sat here because it was where Pamela could find him, where he could watch her move through the diner, serving coffee, cutting toast, offering small kindness to people who'd probably never know how much they meant. "You weren't all bad, were you, Mr. Franklin?" Pamela whispered to the empty seat across from her. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like fingers. The new neon sign flickered, Franklin's table, casting warm light across the wet pavement. Somewhere down the street, a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the diner before disappearing into the night. And Pamela Richard, who'd inherited an empire and chosen to transform it into something better, sat in booth 7 and remembered. She remembered the old man with the fedora and gloves and faded rose tattoo, the man who'd tipped $100 and struggled with his knife, the man who'd talked about loyalty and betrayal and friends who were buried, the man who'd built his life on fear and ended it trying to buy back his humanity, one small kindness at a time. Kindness, Herbert had told her once, late on a Tuesday night when the diner was empty and they were the only two souls in the world, is the one thing even the devil can't buy back. You spend your whole life taking, hurting, building walls. And then one day you realize all the money and power and fear in the world can't get you what you really want, which is for someone to look at you and see a person instead of a monster. She'd asked him then if he believed in redemption. He'd been quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee like it held answers. Finally, he'd said, "I don't know if someone like me can be redeemed, but I know that you cutting my toast without being asked felt more valuable than anything I ever stole or bought, or threatened my way into owning." And now, sitting in his booth with rain streaming down the windows and the coffee gone cold, Pamela understood. Herbert Franklin had been a killer, a criminal, a man who'd done terrible things and hurt countless people. But he'd also been human, flawed, searching, desperate for connection in the same way everyone was desperate for connection, whether they admitted it or not. And in the end, what had saved him, what had given his death meaning beyond the violence of his life, was a waitress who'd treated him with dignity when he deserved none. That's what kindness did. It didn't erase the past. It didn't justify the crimes or absolve the guilt. But it proved that even the worst of us could still recognize goodness when we saw it, could still be moved by it, could still, in our final days, try to become something better than what we'd been. Pamela picked up the cold coffee and carried it to the counter. She dumped it in the sink and washed the cup carefully, drying it with a clean towel before replacing it on the shelf with the others. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, she'd brew a fresh cup and place it on Booth 7's table. And the night after that, and the night after that. For as long as she owned Franklin's table, Herbert Franklin would have a seat at the table, reserved, waiting. A reminder that everyone, even devils who'd spent a lifetime earning damnation, deserved a chance at redemption. And that sometimes redemption came not in grand gestures or public confessions, but in the quiet moments between a waitress and an old man over coffee and pie. In kindness offered without expectation. In dignity given without judgment. In the simple act of cutting someone's toast when their hands trembled too much to do it themselves. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean. The neon sign buzzed softly, Franklin's table, a beacon in the darkness for anyone looking for a place where they could be seen as human, regardless of who they'd been before. And in Booth 7, the reserved sign waited. Because some tables should always be ready, some seats should always be saved. For the ghosts who taught us that kindness, in the end, is the one thing that saves us all.